I'd like to add my thanks to Monica and John for the invitation, and also just add thanks to all of you for attending, coming to listen this evening. If so far we've heard, I think, a specific phrasing of the question about the relationship between history and contemporary practice, phrased as follows: how is an architect using history? So how is she locating her work within a historical lineage, for example, or how is she proposing a kind of determining historical context that legitimates or leads up to her own work in the present? I want to begin by phrasing this slightly differently, inverting the question, and ask us to consider, how does history position the architect? So how does history position the architect as a practitioner and as a person? My framing of the open question then would be, how does the contemporary practitioner perform a historical role? Or maybe just more bluntly, how does history use the practitioner? So in other words, I want to approach the function of history in contemporary practice not from the point of view of the work, but from the point of view of the persona. And to discern history as the present and the future, not of the architectural work, but of the persona. And rather than chasing this function along the contours of fame and self-fashioning, I'll offer instead a few remarks on anonymity. And I'd like to ask you to give some thought then to anonymous, to that person who is fully within history, yet who is in a very particular way unrecognized by history. Anonymity should not be too readily equated with the simple state of being unknown. Anonymity is rather a very specific, acknowledged lack of recognition. It's an explicit lack of recognition or withholding of recognition. For some characteristic forms of anonymity in architectural modernity, one might first think of the corporation. The corporation, the anonymity of the corporation man has, of course, become really a cultural commonplace over the last full century. And in the large corporate firm, in SOM or HOK or Gensler, for example, there are points of recognition, certainly as indicated by the use of the partners' names or initials as synonyms for the company. But those points of recognition only illuminate that much more clearly the much more extensive condition of unrecognized architects carrying out the practice of the firm. Unrecognized, but certainly not unknown, for all of these architects are known. Their names are on the company website. Here, click on any one of the candy-colored dots on the Gensler website, and you get a name, a photograph, and a biography. Their names are certainly in the databases of the IRS. Their names are definitely on the mailing lists of the development offices, of the alumni offices of their universities. So they participate fully in the economy of the discipline. They are the agents of its pertinent performative acts, of contracts and of stamped drawings and of press releases and change orders. So they're unknown. They're not unknown, but they are anonymous. For another and different characteristic form of an anonymity in architectural modernity, one might consider the disciplinary practices now very loosely gathered under the category of parametricism. Parametrics, as it's developed from the 1960s until now, has certainly raised anew the difficulty of architectural authorship. In this case, through the insertion of a deliberate and really quite profound distance between agent and outcome. In some recent lectures and debates, I've heard the recurring question, I'm sure you've heard it as well, the question of whether the authorial act in the parametric category or domain, whether the authorial act will be the design of the parametric process itself, the script, or whether the authorial act will now be the decision to arrest that project at some particular stage, or whether the authorial act is in fact the use and the implementation of the consequent products that ultimately result from the script and its deliberate arrest. I'm not actually concerned with which one of those it might be, but I am concerned with the rather evident emergence of new forms here of authorial removal, of a removal of the author, or the further possibility that such removals might now prompt new forms of anonymity in architectural practice. For while the distancing of the design from the actual building is a very familiar, well-established concept in our discipline, in its earlier incarnations, that distancing was always accompanied by very particular acts of recognition. So I'm thinking here, of course, of the architectural drawing as an assertion of authorship that is reciprocated by a recognition of agency. So the architectural drawing was an extension of the architect. It functioned as the architect's signature, and its attribution was therefore recognition of the architect himself. When the drawing becomes code, does the same process of recognition still obtain? Or does it produce the basis for withholding recognition, the basis for a new form of anonymity? Put another way, can a code ever be a signature? Signature is an assertion that can be made in relation to an architecture, and individuation is certainly its salient characteristic. But although signature is now inevitably the invocation of starchitects and their signature buildings, the architect as brand is actually only a very narrow manifestation of signature. I would resist understanding signature as a mere synonym for style, as a synonym for the confirmation of some prior expectation of what an architect will do. Even here, the two distinctive signatures, actual signatures, of Peter Eisenman and Michael Graves, the double pen of the one and the seemingly careless sketch of the other, are as much propositional arguments as they are affirmations of a position. Consider the man who was perhaps the least anonymous of architects, Philip Johnson. Philip Johnson did not have a signature style, yet Johnson's work was explicitly and unmistakably signed. It was credited to Johnson, credited because he himself always offered the warrant of signature. But he only rarely offered his signature in the form of a drawing. Much more often, that warrant was offered in text or in spoken word or in a photograph or photographic form. Crucially, Johnson did not withhold his signature from even his truly lesser achievements. When asked once by a questioner at the AA whether he didn't agree that some of his buildings were facile, Johnson simply answered, "But this is because I'm a bad architect." The other thing we all know about Johnson is that he was deeply and consistently engaged with the historical dimension of architecture. His historicist buildings, his nonchalance about imitation to the point that he seemed really to delight in plundering the past of architecture, but also his keen formulation of lineages, of genealogies, for his own work and for that of other modern architects. All these evidence a conviction that architecture consisted in no small measure of a calibration of a given architect's participation in history. Take Johnson's famous essay on his own glass house. With its depiction of complicated overlapping sourcings and trajectories of influence for the glass house, as both an articulated and disarticulated whole, the essay is a very clear example of what I began by calling the practitioner's use of history. Equally important in Johnson's captions here, though, is the frequency of the first-person voicing. I imitated, I copied, I did this, which is an instance of signature that suggests an example of my latter question, or my revised question: how does a practitioner participate in history through the performance of a historical role? Signature is a contract with history. Signature acknowledges a relationship between a work and its creator at the moment of creation, but it also extends that acknowledgement indefinitely forward into the future. The literary theorist Sean Burke has described this effect as, quote, a structure of resummons, whereby the author may be recalled to his or her text. The signature, he continues, is addressed to the future. It, quote, offers itself to any tribunal which may be subsequently established upon the basis of the signatory's text in relation to as yet unrealized historical circumstances. The signature accedes to this tribunal. Burke described this potential for resummons as an ethical function, whereby, for example, an author could be called to account for his or her words at some later date. But he noted also that this function might serve to protect an author from the interpretation of his work, or indeed to protect a work from the interpretation of its author. The well-known instances that he references of Paul Taubman and Martin Heidegger and the effects of the discovery of their activities before and during the Second World War have their parallel in Johnson's biography as well, in the now increasingly detailed accountings of Johnson's participation in the fascist movements of Nazi Germany and the United States. These accountings are accountings in both senses of the word. They're both inventories of facts, and they're also moral assessments. And the signature that Johnson appended to his architectural works now places those works under the same accountings. His architecture is regarded not just for its use of history, but is also regarded through the lens of a role performed by Johnson within history. Such is the contract with history signed by signature. But what then are the consequences for this contract when the signature reads anonymous? Michel Foucault noted that with the modern notion of the author, or what he characterized as the author function, the relation between author and text was fixed by signature so that the circulation of illicit and transgressive discourses could be disciplined, curtailed, contained. An author's signature was an acceptance of liability for the undersigned contents. And so, in order to evade just that discipline, that curtailment, the signature anonymous appeared in its modern form. Anonymity rewrites the contract with history, loosening, although not severing, the conjunction of work and persona, so that any future tribunal can no longer resummon the author in the same way or to the same standard of presence and presentness. When the signature reads anonymous, no specific identity can be entered under judgment. No determined past is announced, and therefore no lineage can be established through the persona and out toward the work. A past exists, nevertheless, is manifest in the existence of the work itself, in its embodiment of decisions made and situational potentials realized. That past, however, cannot be described by the tribunal. It must instead be posited. It must be put forward as the tribunal's claim, a claim which in a sense burdens judgment. Anonymity is then the voiding, but not the erasure of signature. As a simultaneous assertion and withdrawal of authorship, anonymity voids signature by its refusal to articulate motives, while also asserting always the singularity of motivation. With the signature anonymous, the motivation that inevitably accompanies signature initiates a more contingent state, in which motives are assigned provisional attributes rather than being determined to possess definitive personal attributes. Returning then to the possible modes of anonymity in contemporary practice that I offered earlier, the corporate office or the parametric project, and a third, actually, that seems to be gaining increasing presence in the field, the collaborative practice. By collaborative practice, I mean these structures of organization in which individuals come and go, brought together only temporarily around specific projects, or for the leveraging of, the temporary leveraging of overlapping areas of expertise. Each of these three structures might be seen to execute a new contract with history based upon the potentials now of anonymity. In proposing that signature sets the conditions for a resummoning by a future tribunal, Burke added that the, quote, shape, agendas, and composition of this tribunal will necessarily be unknown at the time of signing, but the tribunal's distinctive form will in some sense be predicated upon the manner of signature and the relation of the signatory to what has been signed. The anonymous signature will then predicate the shape and agenda of inquisition of an architectural practice by a tribunal. But the particular relation of signatory to what has been signed is, in the case of anonymous, a relation premised upon a determinate void, a distance, or a displacement. In effect, motive, architectural motive, now attaches not to a person, but rather to the function of a person. For example, in the corporate office, the provisional attribution of motivation would now be assigned typically to the named partner as the embodiment of all of the firm's work. In a parametric project, perhaps motive is diffused into the procedures of the non-human agency of the code itself. And in the collaboration, motive now seems to be provisionally assigned instead to exigency, to the merely fortuitous or the merely possible. Motive, thus displaced, is now in a literal sense depersonalized. It does not, however, become abstract or non-human. Rather, this depersonalized condition affected by the anonymous signature consists of a transfer. It's a transfer between attributes of personality and personhood and attributes of institution or system or technique. I would propose that this different contract with history executed by Anonymous may thus construe in advance, construe at the moment of signing, a very different tribunal. A tribunal that will judge functions rather than decisions, will judge fictions rather than facts, and will judge fortune rather than fate. I've left unsaid one important aspect of all this, and so I should end by stating the very obvious but crucial point, which is that the potentiality of the anonymous signature can only be realized by the practitioner who is bold enough to sign her work as anonymous. Thank you.